It's 2009. A phone rings in a cavernous, cold, and quiet stately home in the English countryside. On the line is a television producer with an unusual request. Can we use your house as the setting for a new period drama? For the owners of Highclere Castle, Lord and Lady Carnarvon, this call isn't just a curiosity. It's a lifeline, because the storybook facade of this iconic building hides a dark and desperate secret, a secret of crushing debt, creeping decay, and the looming threat of utter ruin. But calling Highclere Castle a house is like calling a Fabergé egg a piece of jewelry. It's a masterpiece, a symbol, and a burden of almost unimaginable scale. 300 rooms. Let that sink in for a moment. To put that in perspective, the White House has 132 rooms. Highclere has more than double that. We're talking about a footprint that covers over 5,000 acres. That's the size of a small town. The castle itself is estimated to be around 175,000 square feet. That's nearly 4 acres of just building. 4 acres of roof to maintain, windows to clean, and stone to repair. And this was in 2009, a time of global financial crisis. While the world was tightening its belt, Highclere was facing an $11.75 million repair bill. Urgent, critical repairs, the kind that if you don't fix them, the whole thing starts to literally fall apart, were priced at $1.8 million. The family, the 8th Earl and Countess of Carnarvon, had just won the 20 tower in the bank. They were, to put it bluntly, on the verge of losing everything. But here's what makes these numbers even more staggering. This wasn't a new problem. This was the culmination of a century of struggle, a battle against death, debt, and taxes that began with a fabulous fortune, a legendary curse, and a world-changing discovery in a dusty Egyptian tomb. This castle, which would become the idyllic, romanticized home of the Crawley family in Downton Abbey, was in reality a gilded cage, a financial black hole that had been swallowing its owners' fortunes for generations. But why? Why would anyone build something so impossibly large, so magnificent, and yet so unsustainable? How did a family, armed with one of the greatest fortunes in England, find themselves on the brink of bankruptcy? And perhaps most intriguingly, how did a fictional TV show, a story of invented aristocrats, become the one thing that could save the real-life legacy of one of England's most storied families? To answer those questions, we need to go back, not to 2009, but to 1895. And we need to understand the woman whose arrival at Highclere would change its destiny forever. Almina Wombwell, the future 5th Countess of Carnarvon. Picture London in the 1890s, the Gilded Age, a time of astonishing wealth and rigid social hierarchy. A city at the absolute zenith of its global power, the heart of a sprawling empire. And at the heart of its high society is a marriage market unlike any other. It's a transatlantic trade in status and cash. On one side, you have the British aristocracy, the dukes, the earls, the viscounts. Men with titles that stretched back to the Norman conquest and houses that were practically geological features of the landscape. They were land-rich, title-rich, but in the last decades of the 19th century, many of them were becoming desperately cash-poor. A series of agricultural depressions had crippled their rental incomes. The very source of their wealth for centuries, the land, was failing them. And the grand estates that defined their identity were becoming ruinously expensive to maintain. On the other side of this equation, you have the new money titans of American industry. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Whitneys, men who had made unimaginable fortunes in railroad, steel, and finance, and they had daughters, bright, ambitious, and fabulously wealthy young women who were, in their own way, trapped. American society, for all its supposed egalitarianism, was still a closed shop. The old money families of New York and Newport looked down on the nouveau riche. So what do you do when you have more money than God, but you can't get an invitation to the right parties? You go shopping for a title. The press had a name for them, the dollar princesses. Between the 1870s and the 1910s, hundreds of American heiresses crossed the Atlantic, trading their vast dowries for a coronet and a place in the most exclusive club in the world, the British aristocracy. It was a cold, hard, and often very successful transaction. Consuelo Vanderbilt, for example, brought a dowry worth the modern equivalent of over $2.5 billion to her marriage with the Duke of Marlborough, saving Blenheim Palace from ruin. 2. 0515. But Almina Wombwell wasn't an American heiress. She was something far more intriguing, and her story far more scandalous. Officially, she was the daughter of Marie Wombwell and her husband, Captain Frederick Charles Wombwell, a businessman and retired army officer. But in the hushed, gossiping circles of London society, everyone knew the truth. Almina was the biological daughter of one of the richest and most influential men in Europe, Alfred de Rothschild. The banking scion, the connoisseur, the art collector, a man of almost mythical wealth, Marie Wombwell was his beautiful French mistress, and Almina was their love child. In an age of rigid Victorian morality, it was a secret that had to be carefully managed. But Alfred adored his daughter. He provided her with a life of unimaginable luxury, a finishing school education in France, and a social launch into society that was second to none. And most importantly, he provided her with a dowry that would put even the wealthiest American heiresses in the shade. On June 26, 1895, the 19-year-old Almina walked down the aisle of St. Margaret's, Westminster, to marry George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. He was the owner of Highclere Castle. He was also, to put it mildly, in a lot of debt. The arrangement was brutally simple, a transaction cloaked in the romance of a society wedding. Rothschild would pay off all of Carnarvon's substantial pressing debts, and he would provide his daughter with a marriage settlement of $500,000. Let that sink in. $500,000 in 1895. In today's money, that's the equivalent of over $72 million. It was a fortune, a life-altering, estate-saving, destiny-changing fortune. It was the kind of money that didn't just pay the bills. It was the kind of money that could fund any passion, any dream, any obsession. And the 5th Earl of Carnarvon had a very, very expensive obsession. While other aristocrats were content to hunt, shoot, and manage their estates, the 5th Earl was a man of the modern age. He was an adventurer, a pioneer of motoring, an early adopter of the telephone and electricity. And soon, thanks to Almina's fortune, he would become the financial patron of one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. He began to winter in Egypt, a place that captivated his imagination. In 1907, he sponsored his first excavation, and he hired a stubborn, determined, and brilliant archaeologist to lead the search, Howard Carter. For years, Carter and Carnarvon searched the Valley of the Kings for the one prize that had eluded everyone, the tomb of the boy king, Tutenkhamun. It was a gamble, a hugely expensive, dusty, and often fruitless endeavor. But Almina's money kept the dream alive. Highclere Castle itself was transformed. The Earl's collection of Egyptian artifacts began to fill its rooms. The house wasn't just a home anymore. It was a private museum, a testament to its owner's grand ambition, funded entirely by his wife's dowry. But Almina was more than just the woman who wrote the checks. When World War I broke out in 1914, she didn't retreat into the safety of her country estate. She did something extraordinary. She transformed Highclere Castle into a state-of-the-art hospital for wounded officers. She took on the role of head nurse, organizing the staff, tending to patients, and using her immense wealth to provide the best possible care. She installed X-ray machines, operating theaters, and brought in top surgeons from London. For hundreds of men, the real Downton Abbey became a sanctuary, a place of healing, run by a woman of incredible determination and compassion. This was the golden age of Highclere, a time of glamour, purpose, and world-altering discovery. In November 1922, their Egyptian gamble finally paid off. Howard Carter sent a now famous telegram to the Earl, who was in England. At last have made wonderful discovery in Valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. Carnarvon and his daughter, Lady Evelyn, rushed to Egypt. They stood beside Carter as he made a tiny breach in the tomb's second door. Carter peered in, a candle held aloft. Carnarvon, impatient, asked, "Can you see anything?" And Carter replied with the immortal words, "Yes, wonderful things." The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was a global sensation. It made the 5th Earl of Carnarvon one of the most famous men in the world. He and his family were at the absolute pinnacle of their prestige. They had it all: a legendary home, a spectacular title, a world-changing legacy, and a seemingly bottomless well of money. It seemed like nothing could possibly go wrong. But they had no idea that what was buried in that tomb wasn't just gold and treasure, it was a curse. Not a curse of the pharaohs, but a modern, far more terrifying curse, the curse of British inheritance tax. And it was about to bring Highclere Castle to its knees. Just 5 months after the tomb was opened, in April 1923, the 5th Earl was dead. He had been in perfect health, but a mosquito bite on his cheek became septic after he accidentally sliced it open while shaving. The infection spread like wildfire. He died in agony in his hotel in Cairo, with his son Porche at his bedside. In a moment of pure Gothic drama, at the very instant he expired, all the lights in Cairo flickered and died, plunging the city into darkness. Back in England, his favorite dog, Susie, howled and dropped dead at the same moment. The world's press, already whipped into a frenzy by the tomb's discovery, went wild. A legend was born: the curse of the pharaohs. It didn't matter that no curse was ever found inscribed in the tomb. The story was too good to resist. But the real curse, the one that would truly haunt his family for generations, was far more bureaucratic and far more terrifying. Back in England, the taxman was waiting, and he wanted his share. The death of the 5th Earl triggered what was known as death duties, an inheritance tax designed to break up the great aristocratic estates. The bill that landed on Highclere's doorstep was for $500,000. In today's money, that's a staggering $30 million. Almina's fortune, the very money that had funded the Tutenkhamun expedition, was now being targeted to pay the taxes on her husband's death. The family was facing a financial catastrophe, and the man who had to face it was the 5th Earl's son, a man completely unprepared for the storm that was about to hit him. His name was Henry Herbert, but the world knew him as Porche, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon. Porche was nothing like his adventurous, high-flying father. He was a quiet, reserved man, a product of a difficult and often lonely childhood. He was a man who had lived in his father's shadow, and now he had inherited his father's crisis. The task of saving Highclere, of preserving the family legacy, fell squarely on his shoulders. But first, he had to survive the fallout from his father's death, and that would prove to be the challenge of a lifetime. Picture this: you're 24 years old. Your father, one of the most famous men on the planet, has just died in a dramatic, headline-grabbing fashion. You've just inherited one of the most magnificent houses in England, a title that stretches back centuries, and a legacy that includes the discovery of King Tut's tomb. You are the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, and you are in very, very deep trouble. While his father, the 5th Earl, was a globe-trotting adventurer fueled by his wife's immense fortune, Porche, the 6th Earl, was a different man entirely. He was a product of a classic aristocratic upbringing, which is to say, it was often cold and brutal. In his own tape-recorded memoirs, he recalled being taken to a Christmas party at Buckingham Palace as a 10-year-old boy. He collided with the portly King Edward VII, knocking the monarch to the ground, and then compounded the error by spilling ice cream on the dress of the king's granddaughter. His furious social climbing mother had him locked in an attic and fed only bread and water for 2 days as punishment for disgracing the family name. After a bad school report, his own father, the famous Egyptologist, ordered him to undress and bend over, whereupon he administered 6 strokes of a birch rod to his bare backside. This wasn't a man who had been groomed for the spotlight. He was a man who had been forged in the rigid, often cruel, traditions of his class. He even served in World War I, where his horse was shot from under him and he was forced to lead a firing squad to execute a spy, an experience that left him so shaken he was physically sick afterwards. And now he was facing the fight of his life. The 500,000 death duty was a ticking time bomb. That's 30 million today. The government wanted its money, and it didn't care that the family's assets were tied up in land, art, and a giant, impossibly expensive house. The pressure was immense. The family's solicitors advised the unthinkable: sell Highclere, sell the castle, sell the land, sell the legacy. It was the logical choice. the only sensible way out of a financial black hole. But Porche did something that defied all logic. He refused. He decided to fight. He would not be the Earl who lost Highclere. He would be the Earl who saved it. And to do that, he had to become a man his father never was, a ruthless, pragmatic, and unsentimental businessman. The first and most painful cuts were the staff. Highclere, like all great houses, ran on an army of servants, butlers, footmen, maids, gardeners, grooms. Porche took a scythe to the staff numbers. It was a brutal necessity. Each salary was a drain on the dwindling resources. He had to choose between preserving the jobs of his staff and preserving the house itself. He chose the house. Next, he turned to the treasures within the castle walls. The fifth Earl had been a voracious collector, filling Highclere with priceless art and furniture. Porche began to sell it off. Piece by piece, the history of the house was auctioned away to pay the tax bill. It was a painful, gut-wrenching process. Imagine having to sell your family's heirlooms, not to buy something new, but simply to pay a debt you didn't personally incur. Each sale was a small death, a chipping away at the family's heritage. But even that wasn't enough. The death duties were just one part of the problem. The bigger issue was that Highclere itself was a financial monster. It cost a fortune to run, and the estate's agricultural income, which had sustained the family for centuries, had collapsed. Porche needed a new source of income, and he found it in a very aristocratic pursuit: horse racing. His father had dabbled in racehorses as a hobby, but for Porche, it became a profession. He turned his passion for breeding and gambling into a serious business. He used the field glasses he'd taken from a dead Turkish officer during the war to watch his horses. He became a respected figure in the racing world, known for his shrewd judgment and his deep knowledge of bloodlines. The Highclere stud became a source of both income and prestige. It was a gamble, but it was a gamble that paid off. The winnings from the racetrack helped keep the bailiffs from the door. Porche was a survivor. He was a man who did what had to be done. And he was a man of contradictions. He was a notorious philanderer, a racy rascal who, according to his own memoirs, lost his virginity on a polar bearskin rug and spent much of his life fleeing from the cuckolded husbands of his lovers. He was a gambler, a drinker, a man who lived life on his own terms. But he was also the man who saved Highclere. He navigated the treacherous financial waters of the post-war era, a time when hundreds of other stately homes were being abandoned, demolished, or sold off to institutions. Between 1870 and 1975, it's estimated that over 1,200 country houses were destroyed in Britain. Porche was determined that Highclere would not be one of them. He kept the ship afloat through sheer force of will. He held on through the Great Depression, through the Second World War, through decades of austerity and social change. But he was only buying time. He had stopped the bleeding, but he hadn't solved the fundamental problem. The house was just too big, too expensive, too much for any one family to handle. By the time Porche's son, the seventh Earl, inherited the estate, the crisis was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. And by the time the eighth and current Earl, George "Geordie" Herbert, took over in 2001, the situation had become dire once again. Geordie Herbert and his wife, Fiona, the current Lady Carnarvon, inherited a house that was, in many ways, on life support. The magnificent towers designed by Sir Charles Barry were crumbling. Water was getting in. The stonework was failing. 50 rooms in the castle were completely uninhabitable, derelict, and decaying. The scale of the problem was overwhelming. They were once again facing the same question that had haunted Porche. How do you save a house that is actively trying to bankrupt you? They tried everything. They opened the castle to the public for a few months a year. They hosted weddings, corporate events, anything to bring in cash. Lady Carnarvon started writing books about the history of the house and its inhabitants, turning the family story into a saleable commodity. They were entrepreneurs, marketers, and custodians, all at once, but it was a constant grinding struggle. As Lord Carnarvon himself said, it was just after the banking crisis, and it was gloom in all directions. We had been doing corporate functions, but it all became pretty sparse after that. By 2009, they were at a breaking point. The repair bill stood at nearly $12 million. The urgent, must-do-now repairs were almost $2 million, and the castle's enterprise account had just over $1,000 in it. They were quite literally days away from having to make the same agonizing decision Porche had faced: sell up or face ruin. And then the phone rang. It was a production company. They were looking for a location for a new period drama written by Julian Fellows. They had looked at dozens of houses, but none felt quite right. Then they saw Highclere. It was perfect. It wasn't just a house, it was a character with a soul, a history, and a breathtaking sense of grandeur. The show was called Downton Abbey. And for the Carnarvons, it was more than just a TV show. It was a lottery ticket, a last desperate roll of the dice. They had no idea if it would work. They had no idea if the show would even be a success. But they had no other choice. They said yes. Picture this: you're the 8th Earl of Carnarvon. You live in a 300-room castle that has just become the set of a major international television series. The world knows it as Downton Abbey, a place of fictional butlers and benevolent aristocrats. But for you, it's home, and it's a construction site, and a tourist attraction, and a constant, nagging source of worry. The reality of life at Highclere, even with the arrival of Hollywood, was far from the glamour portrayed on screen. Before the cameras started rolling, the Carnarvons were living a life of what you might call managed decline. They weren't poor in the conventional sense, but they were house poor on an epic scale. Every penny the estate generated was poured back into the gaping maw of the castle's maintenance. Lady Carnarvon has been candid about the challenges. Perhaps in the past, an estate and house defined and supported the family and their lifestyle, she said, but today it is quite the reverse. The challenge is how Geordie and I seek to support and look after Highclere. They were competing not just with other stately homes, but with modern, purpose-built attractions. As Lady Carnarvon put it, we have to compete with attractions like the London Dungeon. They had to be creative, constantly inventing new ways to monetize their heritage without cheapening it. They hosted vintage car rallies, food, festivals, and concerts. They turned derelict estate buildings like the grand Roman-style archway called the London Lodge into charming holiday lets. It was a constant hustle, a 24/7 job of turning history into income. Then the film crews arrived, and the reality of living in a film set is not as glamorous as it sounds. For months at a time, the family's home was taken over. Their private rooms were off limits, but the grand staterooms, the library, the saloon, the dining room, became the domain of actors, directors, and technicians. The Carnarvons would often have to navigate through a maze of cables, cameras, and lighting rigs just to get from one part of their house to another. Imagine the sheer surrealism of it. Your home, a place of private memories, is suddenly filled with famous actors pretending to be your ancestors. The Carnarvons had to develop a new rhythm of life, dictated by call sheets and shooting schedules. The staterooms were off limits during filming, which could last for months. The family would essentially be living behind the scenes in their own house. Dame Maggie Smith, who played the formidable Dowager Countess, had her own private dressing room in the castle, tucked away behind a hidden door in the library, a room that was part of the family's private quarters. The actors became temporary residents, their famous faces a common sight in the corridors. The family had to live their lives around the artifice. They would often eat their meals in a small private kitchen, while just a few yards away, a lavish, multi-course, fictional dinner for the Crawley family was being meticulously arranged and filmed in their grand dining room. The smell of real food from the massive catering trucks parked on the pristine lawns would mingle with the sight of perfectly sculpted, but ultimately inedible, prop food sitting under hot studio lights for hours on end. It was a daily collision of reality and fantasy, the hard, grinding work of running a modern estate juxtaposed with the effortless fictional elegance of a world that never truly existed. The show's success was gradual and then sudden. It was a hit in the UK in 2010, but when it aired in the US, it became a cultural phenomenon. The Downton effect was born. And for Highclere, it was like a tidal wave. The number of visitors wanting to see the real Downton Abbey exploded. Before the show, they had a basic ticketing system. After, they had to install a computerized advanced booking system to handle the demand. Visitor numbers doubled to 100-200 people a day. Every day the castle was open. These weren't just British tourists. They were coming from all over the world, Americans, Australians, Chinese, Brazilians, all of them wanting to walk the same halls as Lord Grantham and Lady Mary. They wanted to see the library where Lord Grantham would read his letters, the grand saloon with its soaring Gothic arches, the sweeping oak staircase that the Crawley daughters would descend in their glittering gowns. The castle was no longer just a historic house. It was a pilgrimage site for fans of the show, and every single one of those visitors was a small victory in the century-long war against decay. Each $20 ticket, each souvenir book, each cup of tea sold in the tea rooms was a drop in the bucket. But for the first time, the buckets were finally starting to fill up faster than they were emptying. The income from tourism, from merchandise, from the licensing of the Highclere brand, from the sheer global recognition that Downton Abbey provided, began to make a real, tangible difference. The pressure, as Lord Carnarvon said, was finally starting to come off. It was, he admitted, a wonderful thing for us. The money started to flow not into the family's pockets, but into the castle's very bones. The rolling program of repairs that had been a distant dream was now a reality. The crumbling stonework on the towers could be fixed, the leaking roofs could be repaired, the 50 derelict rooms that had been slowly rotting away could finally be restored. A project began to open up the castle's towers to visitors, creating a new exhibition space dedicated to the architect, Sir Charles Barry. But here's the hidden truth about that success. It didn't solve the problem overnight. The $12 million repair bill was a massive hole to fill. The income from the show, while significant, was a fraction of what was needed. The real value of Downton Abbey wasn't just the location fee. It was the platform, the global marketing campaign that the Carnarvons could never have afforded on their own. It turned Highclere from a struggling stately home into an international tourist destination, and it allowed them to fully monetize their other unique asset, the Egyptian connection. The castle's cellars were converted into a stunning museum, displaying the artifacts from the 5th Earl's earlier excavations, the ones that preceded the Tutankhamun discovery. Visitors could now come for Downton, but stay for Egypt, a 1-2 punch of historical tourism that was unique in the world. As the show's executive producer, Gareth Neame, stated flatly, "I think Downton Abbey secured Highclere's future." But the irony is profound. A fictional family, the Crawleys, who were themselves constantly worrying about the future of their estate, ended up saving the real-life estate of the Carnarvons. The on-screen drama of entail and inheritance, of financial woes and the struggle to maintain a great house was a mirror of the off-screen reality. The difference was, for the fictional Crawleys, a convenient marriage or a surprise inheritance would always save the day. For the real-life Carnarvons, the savior came in the form of a television show, a show that romanticized the very lifestyle that had pushed them to the brink. Picture this. It's 2015. The final series of Downton Abbey is airing. The world is saying goodbye to the Crawleys. But for the Carnarvons, the work is just beginning. The cameras may be leaving, but the crowds are not. The global phenomenon of the show has transformed Highclere Castle from a private home into a public monument. And with that transformation comes a new kind of crisis. The very thing that saved them now threatens to consume them. They have escaped the prison of debt, only to find themselves in a gilded cage of their own making. The success of Downton Abbey was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought in the money to fix the roof, restore the towers, and secure the immediate future of the estate. The accounts for Highclere Enterprises showed a dramatic turnaround. Assets nearly trebled to around $1 million in the years following the show's debut. The business was, for the first time in a century, on a stable footing. But on the other hand, it created an insatiable global demand. The expectation was that Highclere would now be Downton Abbey forever. But a house is not a film set. A house breathes, it lives, it changes, and it needs to rest. The sheer volume of foot traffic, 100-200 people a day, takes a toll. The wear and tear on the floors, the furniture, the very fabric of the building is immense. The Carnarvons had to find a delicate balance between capitalizing on their newfound fame and preserving the fragile history they were charged with protecting. They couldn't just throw open the doors 365 days a year. The house needed time to recover. The family needed time to actually live in their own home. This is where the second protagonist of our story truly steps into the spotlight. Not a person, but a partnership. The modern entrepreneurial spirit of the 8th Earl and Countess, Geordie and Fiona Carnarvon. While the 6th Earl, Porche, was the stoic survivor, the man who held the line against collapse, the current Carnarvons are the architects of its resurrection. And Lady Carnarvon, in particular, has become the public face and the driving force of the new Highclere. While her husband, the Earl, focuses on the long-term strategy of the estate and the farm, Lady Carnarvon has become a one-woman marketing and media powerhouse. She understood that the Downton Abbey brand was a gift, but it wouldn't last forever. You have to keep the story alive. She started a blog, sharing personal anecdotes and historical tidbits about life at the castle. She wrote best-selling books about the real history of Highclere, like the story of Lady Almina in the WWI hospital. She became a television personality in her own right, hosting documentaries and giving tours to celebrity interviewers. She effectively transformed the role of the Countess from a private, domestic one into a public-facing, commercial one. She's part historian, part CEO, part tour guide, part celebrity. It's a role that would have been unthinkable to her predecessors, but it's the role that the 21st century aristocracy must adopt to survive. As she herself has said, "What you do is never sit on your laurels. Every single day, don't take anything for granted." But the crisis is never truly gone. It just changes shape. The financial threat may have receded, but it's replaced by the threat of irrelevance. What happens when the Downton Abbey fever finally fades? What happens when the next big period drama comes along, filmed in a different castle? The Carnarvons know they have a limited window of opportunity to convert the show's cultural capital into long-term financial stability. And then, just as they were hitting their stride, the world threw a new crisis at them: the COVID-19 pandemic. The tourism industry, the lifeblood of the new Highclere, shut down overnight. The gates were locked, the crowds vanished, the income dried up. For a business model so reliant on public access, it was a devastating blow. It was a stark reminder of how fragile their success really was. All the old anxieties, the fears of ruin that had haunted the family for generations, came flooding back. Then came Brexit, which created staffing shortages. Then, the cost of living crisis, which squeezed visitor spending. The challenges are relentless. It's a constant battle. The bottom line, as Lady Carnarvon admits, is still quite thin. The dream of simply fixing the house and being done with it is a fantasy. The reality is that a house like Highclere is a perpetual project. It will never be finished. The maintenance is a cycle without end. This is the dark reality behind the beautiful dream of Downton Abbey. The house is a paradox. It is a national treasure that is privately owned. It is a symbol of aristocratic stability that has been in a constant state of financial crisis. It is a family home that must function as a major tourist attraction. The Carnarvons are not just living in a house, they are the custodians of a living museum, and they are responsible for its survival. They don't have the option of simply walking away. The weight of that responsibility is immense. To truly understand the crisis, you have to understand the building itself. Highclere isn't just a big house, it's a masterpiece of a very specific and very expensive architectural style. When the 3rd Earl hired Sir Charles Barry in 1838, he wasn't just renovating a house, he was making a statement. Barry, who was simultaneously designing the new Houses of Parliament in London, was the most famous architect of his day, and he brought all his genius for grandeur to Highclere. He wrapped the original, simpler Georgian house in a new skin of golden bath stone, creating a fantasy of a building in what's known as the Jacobean style. It's a Victorian mashup of Elizabethan and Jacobean architecture with a heavy dose of Italian Renaissance flair. Barry himself called it Anglo-Italian. Think soaring towers, intricate stonework, and a dramatic, almost theatrical skyline. The central tower alone is a work of art, but it's also a maintenance nightmare. The north, east, and south sides were completed by the time the third Earl died in 1849. But the interior and the entire west wing were still a building site. It took another architect, Thomas Allen, and another 30 years to finally complete the vision in 1878. And the interior is just as complex. The central saloon, with its soaring 50-foot-high vaulted ceiling and its Gothic-inspired arches, is designed to evoke the great hall of a medieval castle. But it's a Victorian interpretation, built with industrial-age techniques. This entire vast space is a machine for consuming money. Heating it is a logistical and financial nightmare. Cleaning it is a task worthy of Hercules. And repairing it? That's a job for specialist craftsmen who are themselves a dying breed. Think about the sheer scale of it. 300 rooms, 5,000 acres of parkland originally landscaped by the legendary Capability Brown in the 1770s. The family today lives in a relatively small cottage on the estate when the castle is open to the public. The rest of the building, dozens upon dozens of bedrooms, staterooms, and servants' quarters, is a vast, empty, and beautiful liability. And the repairs are never-ending. A stately home is, by its very nature, a structure in a managed state of decay. You are in a constant race against time, weather, and gravity. So how do you make it work? You diversify, you innovate, you embrace the very commercialism that the old aristocracy would have scorned. The Carnarvons have become masters of the brand extension. They launched their own brand of Highclere Castle gin using botanicals grown on the estate, turning their very land into a liquid asset. They host massive events like the Battle Proms picnic concerts, where thousands of people pay to sit on the lawns and watch fireworks explode over the famous silhouette of the castle. They've leaned into the American market, hosting lavish-themed weekends and dinners. They've licensed the name for everything from cigars to clothing. They are constantly looking for new revenue streams, new ways to make the estate pay for itself, because they know that the moment they stop, the decay will start to set in again. It is a relentless, exhausting, and often thankless task. The public sees the glamour, the history, the romance. They don't see the spreadsheets, the board meetings, the constant worry. They don't see the sleepless nights spent wondering how to pay for the restoration of a single crumbling turret, a cost that could run into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. The crisis for the modern Carnarvons is not a single dramatic event like a death duty bill. It's a slow, grinding, perpetual war against entropy. And it's a war they can never truly win, only continue to fight. And the stakes are nothing less than the survival of one of the most iconic buildings in England. So we come back to the questions we asked at the beginning. Why would anyone build something so impossibly large? And how, against all odds, has it survived? The first question is a matter of history. Highclere, as we see it today, is a product of the Victorian era's obsession with status, grandeur, and a romanticized vision of the past. It was built by the third Earl of Carnarvon and his architect, Sir Charles Barry, to be a statement, a declaration in stone and mortar of the family's power, prestige, and permanence. It was designed to awe, to impress, to be a palace in all but name. They built it because, in their world, that's what you did. You solidified your legacy in the landscape. But the second question, the question of survival, is the real heart of our story. And the answer is not a single secret, but a series of them. A chain of desperate gambles, ruthless decisions, and incredible strokes of luck that have kept this house alive for over a century of turmoil. The first secret to its survival was Almina's fortune. Without the Rothschild dowry in 1895, Highclere would have almost certainly been sold off by the fifth Earl. It was that injection of new money that saved it from the agricultural depression that claimed so many other estates. It funded the modernization of the house and, of course, the Egyptian expedition that would define the family's legacy. The second secret was the grim determination of Porche, the sixth Earl. When the $30 million death duty threatened to destroy his inheritance, he did not buckle. He made the hard, unsentimental choices. He slashed the staff, sold the art, and turned his hobby into a business. He was the quintessential survivor, the man who held the line when everything seemed lost. He was the bridge between the age of aristocratic certainty and the age of modern uncertainty. His pragmatism, born of a harsh upbringing, was the grit that got Highclere through the leanest decades of the 20th century. And the third secret, the one that no one could have ever predicted, was Hollywood. The phone call in 2009 from the producers of Downton Abbey was the ultimate deus ex machina, a stroke of lightning that illuminated the castle for a global audience and turned its greatest liability, its size and grandeur, into its greatest asset. The show didn't just provide a location fee, it provided a narrative. It gave millions of people a reason to care about this big old house in the English countryside. It created an emotional connection, a sense of shared ownership that is the holy grail for any heritage attraction. And that leads to the final, and perhaps most important, secret to Highclere's survival: adaptation. The Carnarvon family has survived because, at every crisis point, a new generation has found a new way to make the house work. The 5th Earl married a fortune. The 6th Earl became a businessman. And the 8th Earl and his countess have become media-savvy entrepreneurs. They have embraced the commercial world that their ancestors would have disdained. They have understood that a house like this can no longer be a private home that is occasionally open to the public. It must be a public institution that is occasionally a private home. This is the dark, complicated, and ultimately inspiring story of how Highclere Castle became Downton Abbey. It's a story about how a family's legacy, built on the foundations of Gilded Age wealth, was nearly destroyed by death and taxes and then saved by the very thing it represented: a fantasy of aristocratic life. The castle you see today is not a relic of a bygone era. It is a survivor. Every stone in its walls, every restored turret, every perfectly manicured lawn is a testament to a century-long battle for survival. It is a story of debt, decay, and desperation. But it is also a story of resilience, reinvention, and the enduring power of a great house to capture the human imagination. Today, Highclere is more than just a house. It's a brand. It's a tourist destination. It's a film set. It's a djinn. It's a global symbol of a certain kind of Englishness, an image of elegance and order that is, ironically, more potent as a fantasy than it ever was as a reality. But underneath all that, it is still a home that has been fought for, tooth and nail, by a family that has refused to let it go. The story of Highclere is the story of the modern aristocracy itself, a story of learning to perform your heritage in order to preserve it. It's about understanding that in the 21st century, the only way to maintain a private palace is to share it with the world, to turn your private history into public entertainment. And in the end, the greatest secret of Highclere's survival is this: it has learned to sell the dream in order to save the reality. The dream is Downton Abbey, a world of effortless grace where problems are solved by the end of the episode and the house stands eternal and unchanging. The reality is a constant grinding battle against time, gravity, and the balance sheet. The dream is what draws the crowds. The reality is what their money pays for. It is a strange and symbiotic relationship. The fictional family saved the real one, and the real one now works tirelessly to keep the fantasy alive, because the fantasy is what keeps the roof from leaking. It is the dark, difficult, and ultimately triumphant story of how a house built for a single family's glory found its salvation by becoming a house for everyone.